The north is cold and full of whispers.
2 documents. That was all it took. They sat at the edge of the painted table, Dragonstone's great carved map of Westeros, cut from volcanic rock by craftsmen dead 300 years, and they looked like nothing. Parchment, faded, ink. The dry, precise handwriting of a man who had spent his life recording other people's history without knowing he was doing it. The first, a copy of High Septon Maynard's personal diary. The language was clerical, almost indifferent. An annulment described with the same detachment a man might use for a grain inventory. The entry continued without pause into what followed: a marriage, a date, a location in the mountains of Dorne, and 2 names written with the same mundane precision as everything before them. Rhaegar Targaryen of House Targaryen. Lyanna Stark of Winterfell. Witnessed and recorded by the High Septon's own hand, as if it were merely the next item on a long administrative list. The second document was a clean copy of the same entry, transcribed by a different hand, a maester's copy, made carefully, the ink still darker than the original, evidence of its recent production. A redundancy. An insurance. The kind of thing a man made when he understood that the only original might not survive. The candle between them had burned down nearly 2 fingers' width by the time Davos Seaworth set the parchment back on the table. He didn't speak immediately. He sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the documents. And then he looked at Stannis Baratheon standing across from him on the far side of the table, hands clasped behind his back, jaw set in the way that meant a decision had already been made, and the world had simply not been informed yet. Outside the narrow window, Blackwater Bay was black. No moon. The Baratheon fleet rocked somewhere in that darkness. 40 ships with men who had eaten Stannis's bread and sworn Stannis's oath. The wind coming off the bay carried salt and brine, and the cold of open water, and beneath that, always beneath that, in this castle, the smell of old volcanic stone. Dragonstone smelled like something that had burned once and never finished cooling. The candle made the carved stone of Westeros shift. Mountains threw small shadows. The wall at the northern edge of the table caught the flame along its pale ridge and held it there, like a border between what was known and what wasn't. Davos put both palms flat on the table. The stone was cold, the specific cold of a room that had never seen sun. "My lord." He stopped. Tried again. "My lord, if these documents are authentic, and I'm not saying they are, not yet, if they are what they appear to be, then there are choices here that don't have to be made tonight." He kept his voice steady and reasonable, the voice he used on his sons when they were about to do something they couldn't take back. "No one knows you have these. Jon Arryn is dead. Whoever he told is either dead too or keeping quiet. The boy on the wall doesn't know what he is. He's never known. He spread his hands. We continue as planned. Your claim is valid. Your fleet is ready. Your men are sworn. We continue." Stannis looked at him. He looked at him the way he always looked at a man who was saying something he knew to be untrue and was hoping conviction would substitute for accuracy. He said nothing for a long time. The candle guttered once in a draft from the window and then steadied. "You read the document," Stannis said. "I did. Both of them." "Yes, then you understand what they say." "I understand what they say," Davos agreed. "I'm asking you to consider that understanding something and acting on it aren't the same obligation." "For some men they aren't," Stannis said. "For me they are." He moved around the table without hurry. He never hurried. Each step placed deliberately, each motion completed before the next began. He stopped at the eastern shoreline and looked at the carved rock of Dragonstone beneath his hands. At the rest of the realm spread before him, cold stone and guttering light and 14 years of preparation laid out in the shape of a continent. "Jon Arryn died because he found what I'm holding," Stannis said. "Someone murdered him for finding it. That tells me 2 things. The first is that these documents are real. Men are not killed over fictions, not men like Jon Arryn. The second is that whoever ordered his death understood exactly what these documents mean under the law." His eyes moved from the table to Davos. "I will not understand the law less clearly than my enemies." "Your enemies don't have your claim," Davos said. "You are Robert's brother, the last lawful Baratheon heir. You've spent 14 years building toward this. You have ships and men and a position no one else can touch. Tonight, right now, you could put those documents in that candle and no one would ever know. Everything continues. He paused. Everything you've built continues. Everything I've built on what? Stannis said. On the argument that legitimacy is real. That law has meaning. That the throne belongs to the man with the valid claim and not the man with the largest army. He let the words settle. And now I have in my hands proof that there is a man whose claim is older than mine and more valid than mine, and you want me to burn it. I want you to be practical. You want me to be a hypocrite. The word landed the way Stannis delivered most things, without heat. Simply accurate, the way a physician names a disease. You want me to argue that law matters when it benefits me and destroy the evidence when it doesn't. You want me to be Cersei Lannister with better table manners. Davos opened his mouth, closed it. The candle threw a long shadow across the carved riverlands. The trident was a dark line cut into stone. Rhaegar Targaryen had died in that river. The realm had believed his line died with him. It hadn't. The law does not change because following it is inconvenient, Stannis said. If it did, it would not be law. It would be a suggestion. And I have never governed by suggestion. Davos looked at him. He looked for a long time at the man he had followed out of a smuggler's boat and into something that felt, in this moment, like either the most honorable act he had ever witnessed or the most expensive mistake he would ever be part of. He couldn't determine which. He suspected it was both. Your men swore to you, Davos said, not to a boy they've never heard of. They swore to the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms, Stannis said. That is who I intend to take them to. Silence, the bay. The cold stone smell. He doesn't know, Davos said quietly. The boy, he's been told he's a bastard his whole life. Yes, he's at the wall, about to take his vows, if he hasn't already. I know. This will break him open. Davos wasn't arguing anymore. He was just saying what was true. Whatever he thinks he is, whatever he's built himself into in that cold place. This will reach inside him and pull all of it out by the roots. And then, you'll hand him a crown. He watched Stannis' face and found nothing in it to argue with. You understand what you're asking of him. I understand exactly what I'm asking, Stannis said. I'm asking him to accept the truth and bear the weight of it. That's what the law requires of men with legitimate claims. It required it of me once. I accepted it. He moved again. North, along the table, past the carved neck with its bogs and causeways, past the forests and cold rivers of the north, all the way to the far end where the map simply stopped, because the men who built this table had not seen what lay beyond. He placed his palm on the pale ridge of the wall, flat, steady the way a man sets his hand on something he has decided to carry. There is a boy at the wall who does not know he is a man, Stannis said. We are going to tell him. Davos sat with the two documents in front of him and the cold salt air coming through the window and the candle throwing its small, insufficient light across a world that had just changed its shape. He picked up the candle. He walked toward the door. Stannis followed. They left before dawn. 16 ships. Warships and transports carrying 4,000 men who had eaten Stannis Baratheon's bread and sharpened their swords on Stannis Baratheon's whetstone and asked no questions, because the men who served Stannis Baratheon understood that questions received answers only when answers were ready to be given. The fleet moved out of Blackwater Bay in darkness. The torches on each mast making a long broken line of fire across the black water. The castle of Dragonstone shrank behind them, those demon-carved towers, those gargoyle parapets, that whole brooding weight of stone going gray, and then darker gray, and then gone, swallowed by the distance and the night. Stannis stood at the prow of the lead ship and watched it disappear. He did not watch it the way a man watches something he loves. He watched it the way a man watches something he is finished with. Below decks, in a small cabin that smelled of incense, and something underneath the incense that wasn't incense at all, Melisandre of Ashai sat before a brazier and looked into the flames. She did this every night. It was not ritual. It was not comfort. It was work, the patient, exhausting labor of reading a language that did not always want to be read, pulling meaning out of a medium that communicated in impressions and shapes rather than words. Tonight the flames showed her two figures. They stood side by side in the fire, visible for just a moment before the shapes shifted and broke apart. One figure burned. That was the only way she could describe it. It burned from the inside, as if there was fire in its blood. The other was frosted over, wrapped in something cold that was not cold the way death was cold, but cold the way winter was cold. Ancient, patient, she could not tell which was which. She sat with that for a very long time. The incense burned down. The ship moved beneath her, rising and falling on the narrow sea's long swells, and she sat very still in the middle of all that motion and tried to understand what she had seen. She could not. She told herself that was not significant. She did not fully believe herself. The temperature changed 12 days out. It happened over the course of a single afternoon, gradual and then sudden. The way the cold always worked, men who had shed their cloaks in the weak southern sun found themselves reaching for them again without understanding why. The light flattened. The shadows went away. The sky, which had been pale blue with thin cloud, thickened into a solid gray ceiling that sat low over the water and pressed down on everything beneath it. The shivering sea. It looked like the narrow sea. It moved the same way, spoke the same language of swell and chop, but it was different in the specific way that a living thing and a dead copy of that living thing are different, a wrongness that the body recognized before the mind caught up. The swells came in at angles, not in the regular rhythms of southern water. The waves didn't crest and break cleanly. They built into walls of gray-green water 20 feet high that hit the hull sideways and turned the ship in the water like a hand turning a coin. Men who had sailed the narrow sea their whole lives grabbed for lines and found nothing in the water they knew how to read. The icebergs appeared on the 4th day north of White Harbor. Not pack ice. Not yet. Just fragments, huge ones, some taller than the masts, floating in water the color of old iron, blue-white in the flat light and absolutely silent as the fleet moved past them. The men on deck watched them in a particular kind of quiet that had nothing to do with discipline. It was the quiet of people encountering something that made them feel correctly small. Stannis stood at the prow through the storms, not because he was demonstrating courage. Stannis didn't demonstrate things. He stood at the prow because that was where the information was, the exact quality of the wind, the precise direction of the swell, the sound a ship's hull made when it was being worked too hard, and the sound it made when it was merely being tested. He stood there in horizontal snow that cut at exposed skin like fine grit, and he watched the water, and occasionally walked back to give the captain a correction that the captain was too polite and too frightened to argue with. The men began to understand, in a wordless way that spread through the fleet from ship to ship, that they were sailing somewhere the world didn't want them to go. And they kept sailing. Lord Wyman Manderley was, as everyone who had ever met him observed, and as he himself acknowledged without embarrassment, a very fat man. He was also, as fewer people observed and as he never acknowledged at all, a very shrewd one. He received Stannis in the great hall of the new castle with the specific warmth of a northern lord who has decided to be welcoming until he understands what is being asked of him. The feast was already set. Wine was poured before questions were asked. Meat arrived before any mention of purpose. They ate for an hour. Stannis ate like a man who considered food a logistical requirement rather than a pleasure. He answered the questions Manderley asked through the meal, about the fleet, about the men, about the weather north of White Harbor in this season, with the same grinding precision he brought to everything, and he asked nothing in return. When the plates were cleared, he produced a sealed letter from inside his cloak and set it on the table in front of Manderley. He said nothing. Manderley looked at the letter. He looked at the seal, the crowned stag of House Baratheon, pressed deep and clean into black wax. He looked at Stannis. Stannis's face told him exactly as much as Stannis intended it to, which was nothing. Manderley broke the seal and read. He was a slow reader, which was deceiving, because what he was actually doing was reading each sentence twice, once for what it said and once for what it meant. Stannis had written the letter with this in mind. The language was precise. The evidence was summarized without embellishment. The legal argument was laid out in the sequential, grinding manner of a man who understood that a thing is only as persuasive as it is clear. When Manderley finished, he set the letter down. He looked at Stannis for a very long time. Not suspiciously, not warmly, with the specific expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental. "My lord," Manderley said finally, in the careful way of a large man who has learned that a large man speaking carefully tends to be listened to. "I am a very fat man who has not seen Castle Black since I was 30 years old." Stannis waited. "But if what you say in this letter is true," Manderley said, "I will send every ship I have." Stannis nodded once. "I expect a Manderley contingent at Eastwatch within the month." "You'll have it," Manderley said. He looked down at the letter one more time, at the name written in it, the name of a boy at the wall who didn't know what he was. Something moved across his broad face and was gone. "The North remembers, my lord. We've been waiting a long time for something worth remembering." Stannis stood, smoothed his cloak, and walked toward the door. The boy's name was Hal. He was 17, had been a poacher before the Night's Watch made him into something slightly more respectable, and he was standing his watch on the eastern rampart of Eastwatch in the blue-gray light before sunrise when he saw the masts. They came out of the sea mist the way everything threatening arrives, gradually and then all at once. One mast, then 3, then more than he could count quickly, and by then he was already running, his boots loud on the stone stairs, his voice carrying ahead of him into the garrison. "Fleet," he was shouting. "Southern Fleet. Baratheon banners. Gods, there's 16 of them, at least." The garrison of 150 brothers went from sleep to armed in 4 minutes. They stood on the walls of Eastwatch and watched the fleet emerge from the mist into the pale morning, warships and transports and the crowned stag on black banners, moving through the shivering sea's gray water like something that had already decided it belonged there. It was, as Hal would tell people for the rest of his life, the largest thing he had ever seen that wasn't the wall. The Raven was written on the lead ship's deck by Stannis' own hand in the same precise characters he used for everything. Lord Commander Mormont. Stannis Baratheon arrives at Eastwatch. He requires an audience with the recruit Jon Snow. Matters of the gravest consequence to the realm. Make ready. He sealed it. He gave it to the maester. The bird went up into the flat gray sky and found the wind and turned west along the wall, toward Castle Black, toward a young man who didn't know his name yet. Stannis watched it go. Then he turned back to the water, where Eastwatch was growing larger, and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The voyage was over. The harder work was about to begin. The summons said nothing. That was the first thing Jon Snow noticed. Every summons from Mormont said something. Bring the ledger, bring the ravens, bring the good candles from the chest under the window. This one said only, come to the solar. Now he was halfway through laying the Lord Commander's morning fire, stacking the wood in the specific order Mormont preferred, kindling at the base. The larger split logs arranged for slow burning rather than quick heat. Ghost was in the corridor outside the Lord Commander's chambers, as he usually was in the mornings, pressed against the cold stone wall with his eyes half closed, and his ears moving independently of each other, tracking sounds the castle's human inhabitants couldn't hear. The direwolf watched Jon go. Didn't follow, which was unusual. Ghost followed for most things. He didn't follow for this, as if he already understood that what was waiting in that solar wasn't something that required a wolf. It required a man. Jon descended the tower stairs and crossed the yard and climbed to the solar, and he did not know, could not have known, that he was walking toward the last moment of the only life he'd ever understood himself to be living. The solar was cold in the specific way of rooms where important things have already been decided. Mormont sat behind his desk. He looked like a man who had not slept, which was unusual, because Mormont slept the way he did everything else, completely, without apology, on his own schedule. Tonight his eyes were the eyes of a man who had received information he hadn't asked for and couldn't unknow. His great hands were flat on the desk, motionless, beside the desk. Standing rather than sitting, because he seemed like a man who made that distinction deliberately, was someone Jon had never seen before. He was perhaps 40 years old, lean rather than large, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as Dragonstone's walls and never softened since. A black and yellow cloak. The crowned stag of House Baratheon stitched across the chest. Eyes that moved to Jon the moment he entered the room and didn't move again, not out of aggression, but out of the particular stillness belonging to men who have decided something and are waiting for the world to catch up. Near the window, a woman. Red robes, a face that was either young or old depending on how the light hit it. She was looking at Jon with an expression he had no name for. Not recognition. Something beyond recognition. The expression of a person who has spent a long time searching for something and is now uncertain whether they have found it or found something that only resembles it. In the corner, a small man with a sailor's hands and a sailor's face, rough and honest, watching Jon the way a decent man watches something painful, with the full awareness that looking away would be worse. The door closed behind him. "Sit," Mormont said. Jon sat. The man with the Baratheon cloak didn't introduce himself. He reached inside his cloak and produced 2 folded pieces of parchment. He set them on the desk in front of Jon, side by side, with the care of a man placing something irreplaceable on an unsteady surface. "Read these," he said. Jon looked at Mormont. Mormont said nothing. His hands stayed flat on the desk. Jon picked up the first document. The handwriting was clerical, precise, a maester's script or something close to it, a copied entry from a High Septon's personal diary, the same hand throughout, recording an annulment and then, without any change in tone or pace, the ceremony that followed it. Jon read it twice because the first time his mind refused to assemble the sentences into meaning. He picked up the second, a clean copy of the same entry, made by a different hand, a transcription, careful and recent, the ink darker than the first. The same words, the same 2 names. Rhaegar Targaryen. Lyanna Stark of Winterfell, written with the same indifferent clerical precision as a record of weather or grain. He set it down. The solar was very quiet. Someone's fire had gone out somewhere in the wall above them, and the cold was finding its way in through the stones the way it always did in Castle Black, not through any opening you could identify, just through the accumulated weight of all that ice pressing down. "Is this real?" Jon said. It didn't come out as a question. "I do not show men forgeries," the man with the Baratheon cloak said. Jon looked at him. "Who are you?" "Stannis Baratheon, Lord of Dragonstone." A pause. "Until recently, a claimant to the Iron Throne." Jon absorbed that. He put it in the same place he was putting everything else, the documents, the room. The woman by the window who hadn't stopped watching him, all of it, in the place where things go when the mind needs a moment before it can process them. "My Uncle Ned would have told me," Jon said. "Your uncle made a promise to a dying woman," Stannis said. "He kept it for 16 years at considerable personal cost. That is not deception. That is sacrifice. They are different things, and conflating them is a failure of precision. I'm a bastard." The word came out steadier than Jon felt. "I've been a bastard my whole life. Every person who has ever looked at me has looked at me as a bastard. My Uncle Ned, Lord Stark, he brought me home from a war and he never—" "You are legitimate," Stannis said. Flat, final, the way he said everything. "Your parents were married by a High Septon whose records we have in hand. The bastard was a fiction. It was constructed to protect you from a man who would have put you in the ground before you could walk." Jon stood up. He didn't intend to. His body made the decision independently and he was on his feet before he understood why. And then he was standing behind his chair with both hands on the back of it, and the room was the same, and the documents were the same, and nothing had changed, except everything. "Even if this is true," he said, and he heard himself reaching for solid ground, for something that couldn't be rewritten by 2 pieces of old parchment, "I swore an oath to the Night's Watch." "I know," Stannis said. "I am here to address that matter with the legal mechanism it requires." "There is no legal mechanism. The oath doesn't. The oath was sworn to protect the realms of men," Stannis said. "Not to the Night's Watch as an institution. To the realms. To men. The Night's Watch was founded by royal decree. What a crown establishes, a crown can release." Furthermore, he didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He simply continued, as if the argument were a wall he was building and each sentence was another stone. The oath was sworn by a man who did not know his name. You swore as Jon Snow. Jon Snow is a fiction built to save your life, a vow made by a man who did not know who he was, to an institution that would never have accepted a true prince as a common recruit. Is a vow made in error. I will issue a formal written release. The watch will have legal cover. Lord Commander Mormont has already been consulted. Jon looked at Mormont. Mormont met his eyes. He's right, Mormont said. His voice was rough, like something was sitting on his chest. I told him I had no legal grounds to refuse. He stopped. I also told him you were the best man to come through Castle Black in 20 years. I thought you should know that. Jon stood with his hands on the chair and looked at the two men who had just dismantled the structure of his life with documents and correct legal reasoning, and he found that he had no answer. Not for Stannis's arguments, not for Mormont's eyes, not for the woman by the window who was watching him with that expression he still couldn't name, or for the sailor in the corner who looked like he wanted to say something kind and understood that this wasn't the moment for it. I don't know how to be a king, Jon said. It came out quiet, almost embarrassed, the truest thing he'd said in the room. No, Stannis agreed. You don't. That's what I'm here for. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a door closing on something that cannot be reopened. And then, Stannis Baratheon, the man who had spent 14 years building his claim to the Iron Throne, who had crossed the shivering sea in winter and walked into a frozen castle at the edge of the world to do the thing the law required of him, went down on one knee, not both knees. One, because that is what the law requires of a lord in the presence of his king, and Stannis Baratheon did not improvise ceremony. The stone floor of the solar received his knee with a sound that was small and final. Your Grace, Stannis said. Mormont stood from behind his desk, slowly, and took a knee beside it. The wood creaked under his hands as he lowered himself. Davos, in the corner, was already down. He had gone to his knee before Stannis finished speaking, because Davos Seaworth understood the moment before it arrived. Melisandre by the window bowed her head. Her expression as she did so was not peace, it was not certainty. It was the expression of a woman who had expected to find one thing and had found something that might be the same thing or might be something else entirely, and could not yet tell the difference, and understood that she would have to live inside that uncertainty until the flames showed her more. Jon Snow stood in the center of the room. Every person in it was bowing. He looked at his hands, the hands that had been laying a fire an hour ago, still faintly black at the knuckle from the kindling. The hands of a bastard. A steward. A man who had been preparing to swear his life away to a wall of ice at the edge of the known world. He didn't know what to do with them. He put them at his sides. He stood up straight. It was the first thing he did as himself, and he did it before he understood that was what he was doing. The Raven arrived at mid-morning. Jon was in the yard when it came, training alone with a practice sword against the wooden post, the same post he'd beaten against 100 times since arriving at the wall. Because some things a body needs to do with its hands when the mind won't stop moving. The cold was sharp and specific, the kind that found the gap between glove and sleeve and settled there. Ghost sat at the yard's edge and watched with red eyes and said nothing, because Ghost never said anything, and Jon had always found that useful. The brother who brought the message was young enough that his beard hadn't fully committed to existing. He held the folded parchment at arm's length, as if distance from it changed what it said. For you, he said. Lord Commander said, he said to bring it straight to you, not to wait. Jon set down the practice sword. The seal on the letter wasn't a seal he recognized immediately. Then he did. The iron fist of House Lannister, and beneath it, smaller, the crowned stag of the Iron Throne. An official communication. The kind that didn't come to Castle Black, because Castle Black existed specifically to be somewhere official communications were not required. He broke the seal and read it, and then he read it again, and then he folded it very carefully and held it in both hands for a moment before he looked up at the gray sky above the wall and found nothing useful there either. He found Stannis in Mormont's Solar, bent over the rough campaign map that Stannis had requisitioned within an hour of arriving, and had not stopped studying since. Davos sat in the corner with a cup of something warm. Mormont was not present, had been absent from his own Solar for 3 days with a diplomatic consistency that suggested he understood the space was needed for things he didn't need to witness. Jon put the letter on the map. Stannis picked it up. Read it. Set it back down with the same deliberate placement he used for everything. As if disorder in small things led inevitably to disorder in large ones. How long ago? Jon said. Not a question. The letter was already days old by the time the bird reached them. Ned was in the black cells of the Red Keep right now. This moment. While Jon stood in a cold room at the top of the world, with a practiced sword's calluses still fresh on his palms. The date on the seal is 8 days past, Stannis said. Then I need to, Jon started. You need to think, Stannis said. Thinking first. Moving second. A boy with a sword cannot save Eddard Stark. A king with an army can. He let that land. You are a king. Let us build you an army. He's my father. The word came out before Jon could stop it or revise it. Not uncle. Not the technically accurate thing. Father, because Ned Stark had raised him and fed him and taught him what honor looked like when it was lived rather than recited, and whatever the documents said about blood and diary entries and high septons, that didn't change. I know, Stannis said. Something in his voice shifted almost imperceptibly. Not softness, Stannis didn't do softness. More like acknowledgement. The difference between a man who doesn't feel something and a man who feels it and keeps moving anyway, which is precisely why you cannot ride south alone. Eddard Stark's life is not worth less than the realm. It is also not worth more. We save him the only way that works. He moved his hand across the map, not dramatically, just pointing, as a man points at things that are true. Joffrey holds King's Landing, Lannister forces, the City Watch, the full apparatus of the Iron Throne. His finger moved. Robb Stark has 20,000 northern men and has fought Jaime Lannister's host to a decisive result at the Whispering Wood. Jaime is his prisoner. His finger moved again. I have 4,000 men and the Baratheon fleet. He withdrew his hand. The Lannisters hold 20,000 men in the field under Tywin, who has just crushed the faint army at the Green Fork and believes he's winning. He looked at Jon. He is winning. For now. He does not know that 2 of his 4 walls just became 3. Jon stared at the map, at the carved-out shape of Westeros and its rough lines and elevation marks, at the distances between things. The wall a line at the top, King's Landing a mark at the bottom of a very long road. Robb doesn't know, Jon said. No, he thinks he's fighting for the North. For my father. Yes, he doesn't know who he's fighting for. That, Stannis said, is what we're going to tell him. They gave Jon a chair, parchment, and a candle. Stannis stood at the window with his back to the room, which Jon understood was not indifference, but the opposite of it, giving him the only privacy the Solar allowed. Davos refilled his cup and didn't look at Jon directly, which was somehow the most considerate thing anyone had done for him in 3 days. Jon sat with the parchment and the quill and thought about Robb, about the last time he'd seen him, Winterfell's yard, winter light. Robb with that grin that had no political calculation behind it, the grin of a boy who had not yet understood that the world was not mostly made of people who meant well. He thought about what Robb knew now, and what he didn't know, and what the gap between those 2 things would do to a man who rode into it unprepared. He wrote, Robb, there are things I must tell you that cannot be put in a letter. Know only this, our father was right about everything. Meet us at Moat Cailin. Bring the host. Bring the northern lords. Bring the Greyjoy if you can persuade him not to eat the messenger. Your brother. Jon, he read it back. Set down the quill. Our father, Stannis said, without turning from the window. He had not appeared to be reading over Jon's shoulder. He had clearly read every word. That is a political choice as well as a personal one. You understand that. I understand it, Jon said. It will read to Robb as a message from his brother. It will read to every lord who intercepts it as a message from a Stark. Yes, both of those things are useful. Yes, a pause. It is also true. Stannis said. "Whatever else it is. It is also true." He turned from the window, picked up the letter, read it once completely, set it down. He walked to the door, opened it, and spoke to the brother standing outside. "Fetch the maester. We have a raven for Moat Cailin, then a second for White Harbor, then a third for every northern lord whose name you can write without spelling it wrong." He left. Davos waited until the footsteps were down the stairs. Then he looked at Jon with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a man who had decided that being honest was the only available gift he had to give. "He's pleased," Davos said. "The letter. He won't tell you that." "I noticed he didn't tell me that," Jon said. "He thinks you're ready. He won't tell you that either." Davos drank. "I'm telling you because someone should, and it won't be him. And it won't get easier to hear later when there's more noise around it." Jon looked at the letter. His own handwriting. Your brother. The most honest thing he'd written in days. The black cells did not have windows. Eddard Stark sat in the dark and listened to the sounds of a city that did not know or care that the rightful Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North was beneath its streets. Breathing air that tasted of mold and damp stone, and the specific rot that accumulated in places where men were kept until they were no longer needed. His leg had been badly set after the ambush in the street. It ached with the deep bone ache that didn't peak and didn't recede, just persisted, a steady reminder that the body he had relied on for 40 years was now in a place where no one was interested in maintaining it. He did not know how long he'd been here. The absence of windows made time abstract. He knew Sansa was in the Red Keep. Above him, somewhere in those towers, his daughter was being kept in rooms with good furniture and warm food and women attendants, which meant she was a hostage in everything but the word, and the word was a courtesy that would be withdrawn the moment she stopped being useful. He knew Arya had not been taken. He held to that. He did not know about the fleet that had left Dragonstone 16 days ago. He did not know about a letter sealed with Baratheon black and yellow that was making its way south along a wall he would never see again. He did not know that 3 men and a woman in red had knelt on a stone floor in Castle Black for a boy who didn't know what to do with his hands. What Eddard Stark knew, sitting in the dark with a broken leg and his honor intact, was this: he had told the truth. He had refused to play the game by its actual rules. He had given Cersei Lannister warning when warning was the worst possible strategy, and he had done it because Ned Stark did not do things the other way. He had been right about the law. He had been catastrophically wrong about everything else. The torch in the corridor outside guttered once and steadied. Somewhere above him, the city moved and breathed and bought and sold and didn't know. He sat with his broken leg in the dark and waited, because there was nothing left to do but wait, and hope that somewhere in the world there was someone with the law on their side who also understood that the law alone had never saved anyone. The torch burned on. The city moved. The raven flew south. Moat Cailin had no roof. That was the first thing. The towers of the first men had stood for 8,000 years, and in that time had been burned and flooded and contested and abandoned and reclaimed and abandoned again, and what remained was what always remained of things that refused to fully die: the bones. Massive stones fitted without mortar, dark with moss, and the accumulated damp of the next bogs pressing in from every direction. 3 towers still standing out of the original 20. The rest were rubble that the reeds had been slowly digesting for centuries. The courtyard between the towers had no roof, because whatever roof it once possessed had gone the way of the other 17 towers, down and slowly, and without anyone alive to mark it. The council would take place in open air, under a sky the color of old pewter, with the smell of bog water and peat coming in from the neck, on a wind that couldn't decide which direction it preferred. It was the oldest place Jon had ever stood. He thought that was appropriate. What was being built here was also old, older than the Baratheon claim, older than Robert's War. Something was reassembling itself in this courtyard that had last been whole before most of the families in Westeros had their names. He stood at the eastern entrance and watched Robb's host arrive. 20,000 men. He had known the number. Knowing a number and watching it materialize out of a northern morning were different experiences. The army came through the causeway across the bog, in columns that went on past the point where the eye could follow. Direwolf banners, umber giants, Karstark stars, the whole weight of the north that had answered Robb Stark's call and marched south to find justice for a man who was already beyond finding it. He watched for Robb's banner. Found it near the front, where Robb would always put it, because Robb had never learned to command from the rear, and probably never would. They met in a small room off the northern tower before anyone else arrived. Robb had grown. That was the first thing Jon thought, and then he felt the absurdity of thinking it. 6 months, not 6 years, but something in Robb had changed its shape. He was broader in the shoulders, and something had gone out of his face that had been there at Winterfell, some quality of openness that campaign and command and the specific weight of ordering men into danger had replaced with something harder and more careful. He looked at Jon the same way Jon looked at him, taking inventory, checking that the person who left was the person who arrived. "Is it true?" Robb said. "Stannis thinks so," Jon said. "What do you think?" Jon stood with his hands at his sides in the cold room that smelled of damp stone and old wood. He thought about Ned, about the specific quality of the secret Ned had carried, the way it surfaced sometimes in unguarded moments, a sadness that wasn't about the present, a distance that had no explanation, about a man who had let the whole realm call him an oathbreaker rather than speak one true word. "I think Ned Stark kept a secret for 16 years at the cost of his own honor," Jon said, "and never told anyone. I think you don't do that for nothing." Robb was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, if it could be called a window, it was more of an absence of wall. The sounds of the combined army assembling drifted in, men and horses, and the particular noise of large numbers of people finding their places. "You're my brother," Robb said. "Yes, that doesn't change." "No," Robb nodded slowly. Something resolved in his face. The decision had been made somewhere on the road south, and what Jon was watching was the last small motion of it settling into place. "Then show me how to do this," Robb said. "Because I've never knelt to a Targaryen before, and I'd rather not look like an idiot in front of the great Jon." The lords assembled in the open courtyard with the gray sky above them and the bog on all sides, and the ancient stones watching with the indifference of things that had seen too much to be impressed by any specific occasion. Jon entered last, with Stannis on his left and Davos half a step behind. He wore his Night's Watch black, the cloak, the leathers, because it was what he had, and because he was not yet a man who possessed the kind of wardrobe that announced ambition. At his throat, the clasp was new. Stannis had given it to him 3 days ago, without ceremony. Setting it on the table beside his breakfast, 3-headed dragon in bronze, small enough to be a detail rather than a declaration. Large enough to be seen. Every set of eyes in the courtyard found it. The Greatjon Umber found it first, because the Greatjon's eyes were the fastest thing about him, and the rest of the Greatjon was very large and very loud, and currently filling the left side of the courtyard like a siege weapon that had learned to stand upright. He looked at the clasp. He looked at Jon's face. He looked at Stannis. His expression went through several stages that eventually arrived at something resembling assessment. "That's a dragon," the Greatjon said, "not an accusation. An observation delivered at the volume of a man who had never learned that walls carry sound." "It is," Jon said. "You're the Targaryen boy. Not a question." "There are documents," Stannis said. "I can't read High Valyrian," the Greatjon said. "Couldn't read it if I tried, which I haven't." He crossed his arms across a chest that could have served as a doorframe in a modest household. "What I can do is look at a man and tell you whether he's who he says he is. I learned it from my father, and he learned it from his." His eyes went back to Jon. Direct, undecorated. The look of a man performing an honest evaluation without caring what result it produced. "Stannis Baratheon, you had a claim to that throne. Good claim. Rightful claim. You're telling me you gave it up for this boy. The law required it," Stannis said. "Aye, that's what I'm saying." The Greatjon's voice carried across the courtyard and died against the old stones. "Any man who gives up a crown because the law tells him to is a man I can follow. And if he's following this boy," he looked at Jon one last time. Something settled behind his eyes. "I'm following this boy." Rickard Karstark had been standing at the back of the assembled lords with the specific stillness of a man who has prepared what he wants to say and is waiting for the correct moment to say it. He was older than the Greyjoy, gray in his beard, with eyes that had been watching southern wars take northern suns for long enough to have developed strong opinions about the direction of grief. "My sons died fighting for justice," he said. His voice was even, harder to argue with than rage would have been. They died for Lord Stark's honor and the North's honor, and they died young. And I would know what that means before I put more men in the ground. He looked at Jon. A Targaryen king means southern wars. Southern wars have a history with northern blood. I'll need more than a bronze clasp and a Baratheon lord's legal argument. Stannis turned to face him fully. "Lord Karstark," he said, "your sons died fighting for justice. I am offering you something they died for but never received: victory, and a rightful king to validate their sacrifice. Not a usurper's heir, not a bastard's bastard wearing a crown his grandfather seized through force. The man standing in this courtyard has a better claim to that throne than any living soul in Westeros. That claim is documented. That claim is legal. And if what you want is justice, real justice, not the performance of it, then there is only one answer." Karstark stood with it. He was not a man who moved quickly toward conclusions. He looked at Jon with the eyes of someone calculating the specific weight of northern dead against the specific shape of what was being offered. Then he looked away. Which, from Rickard Karstark, was the answer. Robb knelt first. He did it without theater, without the performance some men brought to formal acts, just went to one knee on the courtyard's ancient stone with the directness of a man who had decided something and was completing it. He looked up at Jon with gray eyes that were Stark eyes, Ned's eyes, the family's eyes. "My father served the rightful king all his life without knowing it," Robb said. His voice carried. "The least I can do is finish the work." One by one, the northern lords followed. The Greyjoy first, because the Greyjoy's decisions, once made, moved fast. Then the others, working outward from Robb through the assembled host, the motion spreading like the first ice across still water. Slow at the edge, then suddenly, complete. Jon watched it happen and felt the weight of it as a physical thing, pressing down through the soles of his boots into Moat Caelan's ancient stones. He went to one knee himself, facing them, receiving their oaths from the same level rather than above it. Stannis, watching from the side, made no sound. But his eyes registered something as Jon knelt, a small recalibration, a single data point being filed with the rest. He said nothing about it. He didn't need to. The oaths were sworn. Above them, the gray sky held its particular northern silence, and Moat Caelan's old stones absorbed the words the way they absorbed everything, completely without judgment. Having heard far older things, and kept them longer than any man alive, Stannis taught the way he did everything else, without warmth, without repetition, without the assumption that a thing needed to be made comfortable before it could be made clear. He taught the way a whetstone works, through friction, consistently applied, until the edge appeared. The first lesson came on the third day of the march south from Moat Caelan, when Jon rode up beside him and asked how long before they reached the Riverlands. Stannis didn't answer the question. "How many men in the combined host?" he said instead. 23,000, Jon said. "How much grain does each man require per day?" Jon opened his mouth, closed it. 2 pounds, Stannis said. Each man. Each day. 23,000 men, 46,000 pounds of grain, every day. From here to King's Landing. He let that arithmetic sit in the cold morning air. An army marches on its stomach. This sounds like poetry. It is not poetry. It is arithmetic, and arithmetic does not care about your cause or your claim or the righteousness of your position. Where is your grain right now? At this moment. Jon looked at him. "You don't know," Stannis said. "Find out. Know at all times. A general who cannot tell you where his grain is has already begun to lose. He simply hasn't received the news yet." Jon rode back down the column to find the quartermaster. Stannis watched him go and said nothing, because the lesson was complete. The second lesson arrived in a letter It came through Davos, who had a network of contacts from his smuggling years that had quietly become a military intelligence asset, sealed in plain wax with no identifying mark. Inside, a child's handwriting. The message was brief and specific, the dimensions of a chain mechanism being installed beneath the Blackwater Rush. The weight of wildfire required to fill the harbor's mouth. The exact placement of the ships Tyrion Lannister intended to use as the triggering vessel. Davos set the letter on the table and looked at it for a moment before he looked at Stannis. "Varys," Davos said. "Yes," Stannis said. "He left King's Landing." Apparently, Davos picked up the letter again. "Read it a second time." "That's not like him. Not how he operates. He stays inside. Works from within whatever structure exists. I've never known him to abandon a post. He set it down. Why would he leave now? Because he has identified the correct side," Stannis said, "and because staying would have meant serving Joffrey, and even Varys has limits to what he'll maintain as cover." He looked at the letter. Whatever his reason, he has never once in his life done something without a calculation behind it that we cannot fully see. We use his information, and we do not trust his motives. These are not contradictory positions. Jon looked at the dimensions of the chain mechanism. The numbers were precise. The kind of precise that came from someone who had personally walked the harbor's floor in the dark, measuring. "We don't sail into the harbor," Jon said. "No," Stannis said. "We don't." Jon studied the map. He didn't look up for a long time. When he did, he had the beginning of something on his face, not a plan yet, but the shape of a plan, the outline of it. "Tell me what you're thinking," Stannis said. Jon told him. Stannis listened without expression to the full account of the three-pronged assault, the feint, the land assault, the tunnel breach. When Jon finished, Stannis was quiet for a moment. "The feint exposes ships," he said. "Which ones? Expendable ones. Name them." Jon named them. Stannis listened. Corrected 2. Accepted the rest. He rolled the map without comment. The lesson was complete. The third lesson cost something. 3 weeks into the Riverlands, the advance riders came back with a report. A burning village, 4 miles east. Lannister soldiers. The village had refused to provide grain, and the soldiers had provided their own answer. Jon rode out with 50 men. Stannis rode with him. What they found was still smoking. 6 houses. The smell of burnt thatch, and something underneath the thatch that Jon's mind identified and then refused to identify more specifically. The soldiers were still there, 8 of them, in Lannister red, sitting around what had been the village well, not expecting pursuit, not expecting anything. Stannis looked at them. "Immediate execution," he said. "All 8. "Wait," Jon said. Stannis looked at him with the expression he used when someone said something he was willing to hear once. Jon dismounted. He walked to the soldiers. He looked at each face in turn, the way he had looked at Night's Watch men during patrols, reading something. The specific quality of guilt versus the specific quality of compliance. "Which of you gave the order?" he said. Silence. Then one of them, a man in his 30s heavyset, with the eyes of someone who had long ago made peace with what he was, looked directly at Jon. "I did. And the rest of you." A long pause. 2 of them couldn't hold his eyes. Jon made his decision. He looked at Stannis. "Execute the 3 who gave orders," he said. "Release the 5 who followed them." Stannis's expression didn't change. They participated. They participated in what they were commanded to do by men in authority over them. "There's a difference." Jon kept his voice even. "Execute every soldier who does what he's told, and we'll empty the Riverlands of men willing to surrender. Keep the distinction alive, and we'll fill our camps with Lannister soldiers who've decided we're worth switching for." The executions were done cleanly and quickly. The 5 remaining men were released south, unarmed, with the understanding that they had been shown a distinction and were now responsible for knowing it existed. They rode back in silence for a full mile before Stannis spoke. "A costly indulgence," he said. "Or a future ally's gratitude," Jon said. Stannis said nothing else. He did not agree. He did not change his position. But he did not argue further, and Jon had been around Stannis long enough to understand what that meant. The 4th lesson was the shortest. Outside Harrenhal, which had fallen in a single night, through a water gate in the foundation that Varys's letter had described in the kind of detail that suggested the spider had a very specific relationship with Harrenhal's forgotten architecture, Stannis watched Jon raise the Targaryen banner above the gatehouse. "Lower it tomorrow morning," Stannis said. Jon looked at him. "Raise it when you take something. Lower it when you hold it. Raise it again when you move." He looked at the three-headed dragon catching the evening light above the gatehouse. "Every time that banner rises, it must mean something. The moment it becomes furniture, it becomes a flag. You don't need a flag. You need a symbol. Symbols require scarcity." Jon raised the banner every time they took a castle, lowered it every morning after. The lords of the Riverlands began to watch for it, began to understand that when the dragon rose, something was changing hands. It made the banner into a statement about momentum, about direction, about the difference between an army that was moving and one that had arrived. Word moved faster than the army did. In villages ahead of the march, people were leaving bread and grain at the road's edge and retreating indoors, not as surrender, as an offering to something they were choosing not to oppose. The Raven arrived on a Tuesday. Jon knew it was Tuesday, because Stannis tracked the days with the precision of a man who understood that time was a resource with the same discipline he applied to grain. The Raven was from King's Landing. The message was 4 words and a date. "Lord Stark is dead." Jon read it once. He set it on the campaign table. He walked out of the tent and down through the camp to the river. The Trident. The same water where Rhaegar Targaryen had died, where everything that led to this moment had begun, in a different season, under a different sky, with different men who couldn't see far enough ahead to understand what they were starting. He stood at the river's edge and watched it move. The Trident was not a dramatic river. It didn't thunder. It moved the way most important things moved, steadily, indifferently, with complete commitment to its own direction regardless of who stood watching. He stood there for a long time. He didn't hear Stannis approach. Stannis moved quietly for a man of his build and his density of purpose, and he stopped a few feet away and stood without speaking for long enough that Jon understood the silence was intentional. Not discomfort. "Company, the river moved. He kept the secret for 16 years, Jon said finally. His voice came out steady, which surprised him. He kept it, and it cost him his honor and his reputation and ultimately his life, and he never told anyone. Not even me." Stannis said nothing. "He was the most honorable man I ever knew," Jon said, "and everyone thought he was a traitor." The river moved. "That's not right," Jon said. "It's not right." Stannis let that stand for a moment. He looked at the river too, at the water moving south toward a city neither of them had reached yet. Then he said, "Now you have something to fight for that the law alone cannot give you. Not comfort, not consolation, the thing that was true." Jon stood at the edge of the Trident and let it land, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The river moved south. The camp moved around them. The army breathed and fed itself and sharpened its weapons and waited for the order that would come when the time was right. King's Landing was still ahead. They could smell the city before they could see it. Wood smoke and river mud, and the accumulated exhalation of 500,000 people living at close quarters, a smell unlike anything else in Westeros. The specific odor of human density. Of too many fires burning in too small a space. The combined host crested the last rise south of the Blackwater Rush at dawn, and King's Landing appeared before them in the gray light, enormous and indifferent, its walls the color of old teeth, its towers catching the first pale suggestion of sun. Jon had never seen it. He sat on his horse at the rise's edge and looked at it for a long moment, the city where his father had been executed, where his mother had been kept from him through 17 years of careful silence, where a boy king with cruel eyes was wearing a crown that belonged to someone else. The walls were high. The Blackwater Rush below them was wide and dark. The river moving with the specific purpose of water that has somewhere important to be. Somewhere inside those walls, in the harbor's mouth, a chain mechanism waited. Stannis rode up beside him and looked at the city with the expression he used for most problems, measuring. "The faint ships are in position," Stannis said. "The wind? Favorable until mid-morning. Less so after. Then we move now," Jon said. Tyrion Lannister's wildfire plan was precise, elegant, and entirely dependent on the enemy doing what enemies historically did, sailing straight into the harbor mouth. Stannis had given the faint fleet their instructions 4 days ago, in the flat, specific language he used for orders that were going to get people killed, and required absolute clarity in consequence. 12 ships, the most expendable in the fleet. They would sail into the Blackwater Rush's mouth at speed, making as much noise as the drummers and the horns could produce, flying full Baratheon colors. They would draw every eye on King's Landing's walls, and every decision in the Red Keep toward the harbor. The chain rose on schedule. From the rise, Jon saw it happen, saw the harbor mouth seal itself, saw the Lannister fire ships move, saw the green light begin at the water's surface before the sound reached them, traveling the distance as a delayed thing, the sight arriving first, and the noise catching up seconds later. The wildfire detonated. The explosion was green and enormous, and covered the harbor mouth in something that wasn't quite fire. It moved like fire, but wrong. Too fast, too hungry, consuming the water's surface the way fire consumed wood. And the sound when it arrived was a physical pressure against the chest, a single concussive note that briefly made thought impossible. The faint ships burned. From the walls of King's Landing, horns were sounding. Voices carried across the water, not words, just the particular pitch of men who believed they had just won something. Now, Jon said, the northern infantry hit the landward gates like weather. 20,000 men had been waiting in their positions since before dawn, and when the signal came, 3 horn blasts from Jon's position on the rise. They moved with the accumulated discipline of 6 weeks of march and 2 years of Robb Stark's training before that. The Greyjoy was at the front, because the Greyjoy was always at the front, and because a man of his size at the head of an assault had a psychological effect that no tactical manual fully captured. Jon was not at the front. He was 200 yards to the east, on foot, with 200 men selected for being quiet rather than large. Davos was with him. The entrance to Varys' passage was exactly where the letter had described, a drainage channel cut into the cliff face below the eastern wall, hidden behind 2 decades of accumulated river debris that had to be cleared by hand in the dark while the battle noise from the landward gates covered the sound. The passage smelled of mold and standing water and the specific underground cold that exists below the reach of any sun. It was narrow enough that 2 men couldn't walk abreast, which meant the 200 entered in single file, torches kept to a minimum to prevent the smoke from carrying ahead of them through the tunnels and announcing their approach. Jon went first. Not because he was required to. Because he had learned something from Ned Stark about the difference between sending men somewhere and taking them there, and he had decided that this was not the kind of passage you sent men into. Davos followed immediately behind him, close enough that Jon could hear his breathing, controlled, steady. The breathing of a man who had done dangerous things in dark places before and had developed opinions about how to manage himself while doing them. Davos had said something about Varys the previous night, quietly, while they reviewed the approach. I've known Varys for years. Known of him, anyway. Watched him operate. He doesn't leave. He stays inside the machine and turns the gears from within. Whatever made him go, it must have been a calculation the size of a kingdom. He'd paused. Which means we should be grateful for it and suspicious of it in equal measure. Jon had agreed with both halves. The passage went for nearly a quarter mile before it rose. The walls changed from cut stone to natural rock, which meant they were inside the foundations of the city now, below the street level, moving through the body of King's Landing like something that was supposed to stay outside. The gate mechanism was where Varys had said it would be. 2 city watch guards. Not more. This was the interior. The passage wasn't supposed to exist, which meant no one was supposed to be guarding it, which meant 2 men was 2 men more than standard protocol required. They were standing in the posture of men whose shift had gone on too long, and who had started having the quiet argument with themselves about whether anything was actually going to happen tonight. One of them turned at the sound of something that wasn't the passage's usual silence. Jon's hand went over his mouth before the man finished turning. It was done without drama, without excessive violence, with the specific economy of a man who had learned the distinction between what was necessary and what was not. The second guard was handled by the man behind Jon with the same efficiency. Then, Jon put both hands on the gate mechanism and looked at it. The mechanism was iron, old iron, which meant it had integrity rather than refinement. It also meant it was heavy, designed to need 2 men, and currently locked with a bar the width of Jon's forearm. He looked at Davos. Davos looked at the mechanism with the calculating eye of a man who had spent decades moving cargo through mechanisms that weren't supposed to move. "The bar first," Davos said quietly. "Then both hands on the wheel. It'll be loud." "On my count," Jon said. He lifted the bar. It came out in a single motion, heavier than expected. He set it against the wall rather than dropping it, because dropping it would have announced the next 30 seconds before they happened. He put both hands on the wheel. He looked back at the 200 men arranged in the dark passage behind him, torches now extinguished. Standing in the underground cold, and the dark, and the specific stillness of people who have committed to something and are waiting for it to begin. He turned the wheel. The gate mechanism screamed. Old iron, old gears, 17 years without maintenance. The sound went up through the stones and into the city above them as a grinding shriek that no amount of battle noise could fully cover. It lasted 4 seconds, the longest 4 seconds Jon had counted since the night in Castle Black Solar when Stannis knelt. The inner gate began to move. The fight at the gate from the inside lasted 11 minutes. Jon moved through it with the specific clarity that had replaced fear sometime in the last 6 weeks. Not courage. Exactly. Not the absence of anything. Just the replacement of the part of the mind that produced paralyzing information with the part that produced useful information. He was aware of where his sword was and where the threats were, and where his men needed to be, and everything else receded to the edge of his attention and stayed there. When the gate opened fully, the Northern Army was waiting on the other side. The City Watch saw it happen, saw the gate open from the inside, saw the Northern infantry waiting, saw the math of it become undeniable. Jon walked through the gate before anyone could identify him, and he said, loudly and clearly, in a voice he'd been practicing in his head since Moat Cailin, "Sheathe your swords. Every man who stands down walks away. Every man who doesn't has made his choice, and I'll honor it." He looked at them. At the City Watch assembled inside King's Landing's landward gate, maybe 300 men, armed, trained, standing in a city they'd been told to defend for a king most of them had never felt strongly about defending. They looked at the Northern Army behind him. They looked at the gate that had just opened from the inside. They looked at each other. The first sword went into its scabbard. Then the second. Then, by the particular logic of crowds reaching a threshold simultaneously, all of them. The Tyrell banners appeared at the river's southern bank just as the last fighting in the Red Keep's outer yard wound down. Mace Tyrell's army, 80,000 strong, the Reach's full might, the force that Tywin had been negotiating toward for weeks, arrived to find King's Landing's gates open and Baratheon and Stark and Dragon banners already flying from the walls. Mace Tyrell looked at his daughter. Margaery Tyrell looked at the banners. She looked at them for a long time, with the expression of a woman reading something more complicated than cloth and dye and embroidered sigils. "Father," she said, "I think we should request a parley." We should request a parley," she said again. The second time was not louder than the first. It was simply more final. Mace Tyrell looked at the walls. He sent the parley flag. The Iron Throne was uglier than the songs described. That was the first thing. The songs described something terrible and magnificent, a seat of power built from the swords of conquered enemies, melted and beaten and shaped by the breath of Balerion the Black Dread himself, a monument to the absolute fact of Targaryen dominance. The songs gave it grandeur. The songs left out that it looked, in the flat morning light coming through the throne room's high windows, like something that had gone wrong during construction and been kept anyway. 1,000 swords. Some of them still recognizable as swords, hilts protruding at angles, blades bent back on themselves, edges catching the light in ways that made it difficult to look at directly. The seat was barely a seat. The back was a tangle of blades that no sane person would lean against. The armrests were sharp enough that every king who'd sat it for more than an hour had come away with small cuts on their forearms, which the maesters had recorded without apparent irony as a recurring feature of the monarchy. Jon looked at it for a long time. Stannis stopped beside him. He looked at the throne with his characteristic absence of theater, neither awed nor contemptuous, simply reading it as he read everything. Information. Data. The sum of its parts. There it is, Stannis said. Nothing more. Jon walked up the steps. He sat. The seat was cold through his leathers. One of the protruding blade edges on the left armrest pressed against his forearm immediately. Not hard enough to cut, but with enough pressure to be a constant reminder that the throne required attention to occupy safely. You could not sit it carelessly. You could not relax into it. It demanded a specific quality of alertness, simply to inhabit without injury. Jon thought that was probably appropriate. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the throne room. The length of it. The columns, the high windows, the floor of pale stone that had absorbed 30 years of Baratheon footsteps on top of 300 years of Targaryen ones. Empty now. Their footsteps echoing where a court had stood an hour ago. Stannis stood at the base of the steps with his hands behind his back and looked up at him with the expression of a man who has completed a long calculation and is checking the result against the original problem. Jon met his eyes. Neither of them said anything. It was enough. They brought Cersei Lannister to the throne room in the early afternoon. She had been found in the passage below the Tower of the Hand, Varys' passage, the same network of tunnels that had opened the gates, moving south with 2 chests and a guard of 6 men who had decided that their personal loyalty to the Queen outweighed their interest in survival. The 6 men had been relieved of both loyalties simultaneously. The chests contained gold, jewelry, and a letter to Tywin at Casterly Rock that Jon read once and set aside. She entered the throne room the way Cersei Lannister entered every room, as if the room had been built for her specifically and was simply failing to recognize the fact. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Her hair, which was always architecturally precise, had come partially undone. Neither of these things had reached her face, which maintained an expression of absolute controlled fury that made her, Jon thought, more frightening composed than most people were screaming. She looked at him on the throne. Something moved through her green eyes, fast, multiple things at once, the specific expression of a person running calculations so quickly the calculations themselves became visible. "You're the bastard," she said. "I was," Jon said. Stannis stepped forward. "Cersei Lannister, you stand accused of treason against the crown, adultery with a member of the royal household, incest, production of false heirs to the Iron Throne, conspiracy in the murder of Jon Arryn, Lord of the Vale." He recited it the way he recited everything, without emotion, simply accurate, each charge as dry and precise as a legal instrument. The penalty under Westerosi law for each of these crimes individually is death. Cersei looked at Stannis. "You're going to execute me." "I'm going to recommend it," Stannis said. He looked at Jon. Jon looked at Cersei. He looked at her the way he had looked at the city watch the night before, reading what was actually there rather than what the moment seemed to require. "Casterly Rock hasn't surrendered," Jon said. A pause. "Lord Tywin has 20,000 men and unlimited gold, and a castle that has never fallen," Jon continued. "A dead Lannister is a martyr. A living Lannister prisoner is something else." He looked at Stannis. "She stays alive. In a tower. Comfortable enough that Tywin can't call it cruelty, uncomfortable enough that he understands it's serious." Stannis held his position for a moment. "She will scheme from any room she's placed in. Then we'll scheme better," Jon said. It was not agreement. It was not concession. Stannis's expression acknowledged the decision had been made and filed it alongside everything else without further resistance. He turned to the guards. "Tower of the Hand. 2 guards outside the door at all times. Nothing goes in or out without my specific authorization." Cersei was escorted out. She looked back once at Jon as she reached the doors. The calculation was still moving behind her eyes. Jaime Lannister was not in King's Landing. He was still Robb Stark's prisoner, in a cage somewhere in the Riverlands where he had been since the Whispering Wood. A raven was sent to Robb. "Hold him. We'll address the matter formally when the host reunites." The formal address came 6 days later, in the throne room, with Robb present and a collection of river and northern lords arranged along the walls. Jaime stood in the center of the floor, unchained, because Jon had specifically requested that, to Stannis's briefly visible skepticism, and looked at the man sitting the Iron Throne with the assessing eye of someone who spent his life looking at opponents and calculating them. He was thinner than his reputation. The whispering wood and months of captivity had taken something physical from him, though it hadn't reached his face, which still wore the particular expression of a man who found the whole world faintly beneath his attention. Jon looked at him for a long moment. "You killed Daenerys Targaryen," Jon said. "I did," Jaime said. No apology. No performance. Just the acknowledgement. He was going to burn the city. Yes, with wildfire. 500,000 people. Jaime's voice was even. This was, Jon understood, not casual indifference, but the specific flatness of a man who had spent 15 years carrying something he'd never been allowed to explain. Maybe more. He would have burned every last one of them, the loyal and the traitor alike. The merchant and the mason and the infant in the cradle. He told me as I held a sword to his throat. He said burn them all. I chose not to let that happen. The room was quiet. "The Kingslayer," Jon said. "That's what they call me." "They're wrong," Jon said. "What you did doesn't have a clean name. That's why they chose an unclean one." He leaned forward slightly, careful of the armrest. "You are stripped of your Kingsguard oath. Your lands and title are forfeit. House Lannister's holdings will be addressed separately." He paused. "You are not executed." Jaime's expression shifted for the first time. "Fractionally, you are released," Jon said, "as a free man of no house and no claim. You may go where you choose. You may do what you choose. Your name is your own." Something happened to Jaime Lannister's face that Jon suspected Jaime Lannister had not planned for. It was not relief. It was the specific expression of a man who had spent 15 years understanding himself primarily through the lens of his guilt, and had just had that lens removed without being given a replacement. He stood for a moment with nothing to push against. Then he left. Joffrey did not go quietly. He had been found in the royal chambers by Robb's men, which had wounded his pride in a way that the subsequent events hadn't improved. He was 12 years old and screaming, not from fear, Jon thought, watching him be escorted into the throne room, but from the specific rage of someone who has never encountered a situation that didn't eventually accommodate him. Jon waited until the screaming stopped. It stopped when Joffrey registered, finally, that the screaming was producing no result. "You are not Joffrey Baratheon," Jon said. "You are not a prince. You are not an heir to anything. Your name is Joffrey Waters. You are the bastard son of Cersei Lannister, and will be recorded as such in every maester's record from this day forward." He kept his voice even. "Not cruel, simply accurate. You will be sent into the care of the faith, to a sept far from any city, far from any court. You will receive an education. You will be safe, fed and housed, and you will not be harmed." He paused. "That is more than you extended to Lord Stark." Joffrey opened his mouth. "Take him," Jon said. Tyrion Lannister had been in King's Landing when the city fell. He had not tried to leave, which Jon found significant. He had, according to 3 separate reports from 3 separate sources, spent the night of the assault sitting in his chambers drinking wine with the specific focused commitment of a man who had decided that whatever was coming, and sobriety would not improve it. He was brought to the throne room the following morning. He walked in without escort, had apparently told the guards he could find it himself, which he could, having spent a year there as acting hand, and stopped in the center of the floor and looked up at Jon with mismatched eyes that processed the whole room at once and missed nothing. "You're shorter than I expected," Tyrion said. "You're not," Jon said. Tyrion blinked, looked at Stannis, looked back at Jon. "He's funnier than you," he said to Stannis. "I am aware," Stannis said. Jon leaned forward. "You know where the gold is. I know where most of it is," Tyrion said carefully. "My father moved some of it before the siege, and I don't know where it went, which is an unusual position for me. I need someone who knows where most of it is," Jon said, "and someone who can tell me where the rest went." Tyrion was quiet for a moment. Behind his eyes, the calculation that was always running in Tyrion Lannister's mind ran a little faster. "Master of coin," Jon said. "The position is yours if you want it. And if I don't want it, then you're a free man with no position and a famous name in a city that just changed its opinion of that name," Jon said. "The choice is yours." Tyrion looked at the throne. He looked at the man sitting it, the bastard boy from Castle Black, the Targaryen nobody had known about, the king nobody had prepared for. "I want it," Tyrion said. Casterly Rock was not a castle built on a rock. It was a castle built inside one. That distinction mattered enormously when you were standing outside it with an army and trying to understand why the math wasn't working in your favor. The rock itself was enormous, a coastal promontory rising 300 feet above the Sunset Sea, honeycombed with centuries of mining tunnels that the Lannisters had converted, over generations, into halls and armories and granaries and passages that connected to passages that connected to more passages, the whole structure so interpenetrated with human habitation that it was impossible to tell where the natural rock ended and the castle began. The original Lannister who had built here hadn't built walls. He'd chosen a feature of the earth that was already a wall and moved into it. And every Lannister since had found new ways to burrow deeper. Jon stood on the ridge east of Lannisport and looked at it in the morning light. "It's never fallen," Robb said, beside him. "I know," Jon said. "Not once. Not in the whole of recorded history." "I know." Robb looked at him. "I'm not saying that to discourage you. I'm saying it so you have the accurate information." "I have the accurate information," Jon said. Stannis made sure of that. He looked at the rock for another moment. The morning sun was hitting its western face directly, which meant the walls above the sea, already unassailable from the water, were lit in a way that made them look less like stone and more like something poured and hardened, geological and absolute. "We're not going to assault it." Robb looked at him. "Then what are we going to do?" "We're going to make it too expensive to hold," Jon said. "And then we're going to wait." The legal proceeding came first. Stannis had insisted on it before the host reached the Westerlands, assembled 5 lords and a tent outside Lannisport, and spent 4 hours presenting the case against Tywin Lannister with the methodical precision of a man who understood that a siege without legal authority was a war crime wearing a different uniform. The charges were specific and documented. The sack of King's Landing, the order given to Sir Gregor Clegane to murder Elia Martell and her children, the deployment of Lannister soldiers acting under Tywin's direct authority to ensure no member of the Targaryen family inside the Red Keep survived, the arrangement of the Lannister forces' entry into the city under the pretense of alliance with the Targaryen cause, which had provided cover for what followed. The lords listened. The evidence was read into the record. Tywin was not present because Tywin had declined the 3 ravens sent to Casterly Rock requesting his presence, each response more contemptuous in language than the last. The final one containing a sentence about Targaryen restoration and forged documents that Stannis had read once, folded, and set aside without visible reaction. The panel of 5 lords found him guilty on all counts. "The siege is therefore not a war," Stannis told the assembled commanders that evening. "It is the lawful execution of a sentence. Every man in this army should understand that distinction and be able to explain it to anyone who asks." Jon watched him deliver it and thought about what Ned Stark would have made of Stannis Baratheon. Whether Ned would have recognized him as the specific kind of man Ned had always wanted the world to produce more of, or whether Ned would have found something in him too cold for real kinship. He decided it didn't matter. What mattered was that the army understood why it was here. And it did. The Baratheon fleet took up position in the Sunset Sea on the 5th day. 16 warships and 11 transports, arranged in a crescent across the sea approaches to Casterly Rock's harbor, close enough to inspect incoming ships and far enough from the rock's walls that the castle's defensive positions couldn't reach them with anything but the largest catapults, which Tywin appeared to be conserving. No ship reached the harbor. Supplies that had been making the coastal run from Lannisport were turned back or boarded. A Tyroshi merchant with a hold full of grain, the specific variety used for long-term garrison storage, which was not a coincidence, was redirected north to feed Jon's army instead, which was a cleaner solution than alternatives. Tywin had gold. In essentially unlimited quantities, the Lannister mines being the foundational economic fact of the western coast. Gold, however, required something to buy. The fleet ensured that the something stayed out of reach. The land investment came next. Jon's combined host, reduced now to 18,000 after the detachments left to garrison King's Landing and manage the riverlands, ringed the Rock's landward approaches in a cordon that closed every supply road. The Westerland's bannermen were the complication. These were Lannister men, sworn to the Rock, bred on Lannister gold and Lannister pride. Some of them resisted. Some of them, in the quiet arithmetic of sieges, began to understand that their lord was inside an impregnable castle, and they were outside it. And the mathematical result of that arrangement over time was not favorable. Jon sent ravens to each bannerman house individually. Not threats. Offers, the same terms he had extended across the riverlands. Submit and hold your lands. Resist and forfeit them. The specific Lannister twist: any bannerman who submitted would receive written acknowledgement that their service had been rendered under compulsion, that their loyalty had been to their immediate lord rather than to any treasonous act, that House Lannister's crimes were House Lannister's crimes and would not be distributed to those who had served without knowledge of them. One by one, over 3 weeks, the bannermen sent their ravens back. The Rock's garrison shrank with each one, families withdrawing support, men choosing not to reinforce a position that could no longer reinforce them. The specific quiet erosion of a foundation that hadn't been built on loyalty so much as proximity to wealth, and wealth was no longer flowing. The taking of Lannisport was a single afternoon's work. The city's garrison had never been large. Tywin kept his military strength at the Rock, not the harbor town. What Lannisport had instead was commercial infrastructure, the counting houses and warehouses and shipping agents that processed Lannister gold as it moved from the mines to the rest of the world. The mechanism by which wealth became power, rather than merely being wealth. Jon entered the city at midday with 500 men and the Targaryen banner carried openly. He made 3 stops: the harbor masters, the counting houses, the grain warehouses. He did not burn anything. He sealed it, stood guards on all 3. Sent detailed manifests back to Tyrion in King's Landing, who sent back detailed instructions on what to hold, what to redirect, and what represented leverage that Tywin would feel more acutely than a catapult. Tyrion's letter on the subject was 4 pages long and contained 17 specific recommendations, 11 of which Jon implemented, and 6 of which he modified based on Stannis' strategic objections. He sent Tyrion a response, noting which 6 and why. Tyrion's reply was a single line: "You're going to be a very irritating king to advise." Jon read it twice and filed it. The tunnels came from Tyrion. Not a letter this time. A personal visit. Tyrion arrived from King's Landing on a fast horse with a saddlebag full of documents and the specific expression of a man who has been carrying a piece of information for a long time and has made a decision about it. He spread the documents on the camp table. Rough diagrams, old ones, drawn by someone who had spent years inside the Rock's foundations with a careful eye and a good memory for spatial relationships. "The drainage system," Tyrion said. He pointed to a line on the diagram that ran along the Rock's western foundation, below the sea level at low tide, accessible through an iron grate in the sea cliff face. "My father's engineers improved it 30 years ago. They also created, as a byproduct of improving it, an access point to the Rock's primary water cisterns." He looked at Jon. "I know about it because I explored it when I was 9 years old and nearly drowned, and my father expressed no concern about this whatsoever when informed, which made a significant impression on me." Jon looked at the diagram, at the line running below the sea, into the Rock's foundation. "We can't take the Rock through that passage," he said. "Not with enough men." "No," Tyrion agreed. "But you can put something in the water supply that isn't water. And then the garrison has a problem that gold cannot solve and walls cannot fix." Jon looked at him. "I'm not suggesting poison," Tyrion said. "I want to be specific about that. I'm suggesting salt. Salt water, introduced to a freshwater cistern in sufficient quantity, makes the water undrinkable. The effect is gradual, noticeable, and, critically, reversible upon surrender." He paused. "It is also the kind of problem that garrisons talk about among themselves, which tends to accelerate certain internal conversations about the merit of continued resistance. Stannis, standing at the tent's edge, looked at Tyrion with an expression that was as close to approval as Stannis's face was physically capable of producing. "The principle is sound," he said. "It is also, technically, covered by the siege's legal framework, which specified no restrictions on approaches to the water supply." "I know," Tyrion said. "I helped draft the framework." The passage was used on a Tuesday night, low tide, with 20 men who had been selected for their ability to swim in cold water and their willingness not to ask questions. It took 4 hours and produced no casualties. The freshwater cisterns of Casterly Rock received their additional ingredient without ceremony. Within 12 days, a white flag appeared above the rock's eastern gate. The terms were delivered by Stannis in writing, as Stannis delivered everything important. They were 3 in number: personal surrender, public acknowledgement of Aegon VI as the lawful king of the 7 kingdoms, and testimony, given formally and recorded by a maester, about the events of the sack of King's Landing, about Elia Martell, about the orders given to Sir Gregor Clegane and to every Lannister soldier who entered the Red Keep that night, about the Lannister role in the murder of Jon Arryn. These terms were designed with a specific understanding of their recipient. Tywin Lannister read them in his solar at the top of Casterly Rock, with the sunset sea visible through the window and the sounds of a garrison running out of drinkable water coming up through the floors. He read them once. He set them down. He did not send a response. He sent nothing. The maester found him 4 days later, at his desk, with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes open, looking at the wall with the specific blankness of a man who had decided that the terms on offer required him to become something the word Tywin Lannister could not contain, and had chosen the alternative with the same absolute precision he had brought to every other decision of his life. Stannis received the news from a rider and sat with it for a moment. "He died as he lived," Stannis said finally, "by his own will and on his own terms." He looked out at the rock, at the castle that had never fallen, that hadn't fallen now either, not exactly, not to assault. "I understand him better than I expected," he said. It was the closest thing to a eulogy that Tywin Lannister received from the man who had besieged him. It was more honest than most eulogies. It was, in its way, more respectful. Casterly Rock opened its gates that afternoon. Jon rode in alone. Jon had chosen the location himself. Stannis had suggested the throne room. It was the logical choice. The existing seat of power. The room where every significant act of governance had been performed for 300 years. The room that announced its own authority simply by existing. Stannis liked rooms that announced their own authority. It reduced the amount of explaining required. Jon had said no. He had said it quietly, without argument, in the way he said things he'd already finished deciding. Stannis had looked at him for a moment, and then asked, with the directness he applied to everything, why? Because the last act performed in that building by the false king was the execution of Ned Stark, Jon said. The first act performed there by the rightful king should be something that costs the building that association, something that makes it mean something different when people think of it. Stannis had considered this for 3 seconds, which, for Stannis, was a long time. "That is not a legal argument," he said. "It is a symbolic one." "Yes," another pause. "Symbols have strategic value," Stannis said. "I've mentioned this." "You have," Jon agreed. "They used the sept." The morning of the coronation was cold and clear, which was unusual for King's Landing in any season. The city had a habit of producing weather that matched its mood. Gray and close and smelling of too many people, but this morning the sky was a pale, specific blue, and the air coming off Blackwater Bay was clean enough to taste. The Sept of Baelor was full. Every seat, every standing space, every patch of floor where a person could stand and still see the central aisle. Lords and ladies from every major house that had submitted. Stark, Manderley, Umber, Karstark, Tully, Tyrell, Arryn representatives, newly emerged from the Vale's careful observation. Small folk, who had been told the gates were open, and had made the decision independently, filling the spaces between the high, born in the specific way of people who had decided that whatever was happening was worth witnessing in person. The High Septon waited at the altar with the crown. Iron and bronze and gold worked together, old materials combined by a craftsman in King's Landing, who had been given 3 weeks and a precise description, and had produced something that was neither Targaryen nor Stark but recognizably descended from both. Simple, heavier than it looked. The kind of crown you could not forget you were wearing. Jon walked the central aisle alone. No escort, no honor guard. He had been specific about that too. He wore black, not Night's Watch black, not mourning black, just dark northern wool, and leather in the style he'd worn since the Wall, because he was not yet a man who believed that what he wore communicated more than how he moved. He carried no sword. He walked at the pace of a man who had decided where he was going and saw no reason to perform urgency about it. The sept was quiet enough to hear his footsteps. He reached the altar. He went to one knee before the high septon, not because it was required, but because this was a place of the faith, and whatever Jon's relationship with the gods. Walking into their house and failing to acknowledge it seemed like a specific kind of arrogance he had no interest in. The high septon spoke the words, the formal language of coronation, older than any living person in the sept, assembled over centuries of kings. Jon listened to all of it. When the crown was placed on his head, he felt the weight immediately. That specific downward pressure at the temples, the constant small reminder. He stood. Stannis knelt first, one knee, precise and immediate, with the particular quality of a man who had rehearsed nothing because the decision itself was long since made, and performance was beside the point. He said nothing. The act was the statement. Robb went to both knees. His gray eyes were wet, which he was making no attempt to conceal, and Jon made no attempt to acknowledge it, because some things deserved privacy even in public spaces. The lords followed, house by house, name by name. The sound of 200 men kneeling filling the sept the way water fills a vessel, gradually and then completely. Margaery Tyrell, who had arranged herself near the front, curtsied with a precision that contained entire diplomatic negotiations inside it. She looked up at Jon from the curtsy, with eyes that were calculating the next several years simultaneously. He met her eyes and nodded once. They understood each other well enough for now. Jon looked at the assembled sept, at the lords and the small folk, and the high windows letting in the pale winter light, and he said the only thing he had prepared. Ned Stark served the rightful king for 16 years without knowing it. His service was real, his honor was real, his sacrifice was real. Everything he lost in service to something true. And I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure that was worth something. He sat. The small council assembled 2 days later in the room, adjoining the throne room that had served the purpose through every reign since Aegon I. Stannis sat to Jon's right, as Hand of the King, with the same expression he had brought to every role he had occupied, complete, humorless commitment. Jon had told him of the appointment in the way Stannis had told Jon most important things, directly, without ornament. "You dragged me off a wall and made me a king," Jon had said. "The least I can do is make you responsible for the consequences." Stannis had said, "That is a remarkably poor basis for a political appointment." "It's also accurate," Jon said. Stannis had accepted without further comment. Davos Seaworth sat across from him as master of ships. He had looked at the appointment for a long moment when Jon told him, and then he had looked at his shortened fingers, the ones Stannis had taken as payment for the onion smuggling, years before any of this. And then he had looked at Jon with an expression that had several things in it at once, and said, "I'll do that." Tyrion occupied the Master of Coin chair with the specific comfort of a man who has found the room in a house where he fits. He had already produced 3 reports before the first formal meeting, each one longer and more precise than the one before, annotated with observations that had nothing to do with coin, and everything to do with the people who moved it. Robb rode north 2 days after the coronation, Warden of the North, with a letter from Jon that contained instructions for the Wall and a personal note that contained something else, things that couldn't be minuted or recorded, between brothers, in their own language. Robb had read it in the courtyard before mounting. He had folded it carefully and put it inside his cloak, against his chest, and ridden north, without looking back. Because he was Robb. Looking back wasn't in him. The Dornish delegation arrived at the end of the week. They came formally, Prince Doran Martell's representatives, carrying the Sun and Spear banner, entering King's Landing through the same gate that Jon's army had opened from the inside. Jon received them in the throne room, with Stannis beside him and Tyrion in the back making notes. The conversation lasted 4 hours. What was said in that room was said between the parties present, and what came out of it was the beginning of something rather than the end of something. An acknowledgment from Jon that the annulment of Rhaegar and Elaya's marriage was a wound that required genuine reckoning. That Tywin's crimes against the Martell family were documented, and the man responsible was dead, and that was the beginning of justice rather than the whole of it, and that Dorne's grief was legitimate and would be treated as such rather than managed. The Dornish representatives left with nothing signed and nothing finished. But they left. And they did not leave angry, which was a different result from what they had arrived expecting, and which Tyrion noted in his records as significant. The snow came on a Thursday. The first snow King's Landing had seen in living memory, not the dusting that occasionally appeared on the hills east of the city and was discussed for weeks afterward, but real snow, falling from a sky that had gone the specific gray of iron and meant it. It fell on the Red Keep's battlements, and on the street below, and on the harbor, and on the bay, falling into salt water and disappearing. Falling on stone and accumulating in the corners and on the ledges. Jon stood at the battlements of the Red Keep and watched it fall. He heard Stannis before he saw him, that specific, deliberate footfall, each step placed with the same intention as everything else. Stannis stopped beside him and looked at the snow with an expression that was not wonder. Because Stannis had grown up at Dragonstone and had strong practical opinions about weather, but that contained something close to recognition. As if the snow were arriving on schedule, they stood in silence for a while. The city below them was quiet in the way that cities go quiet under unexpected snow, the specific muffled quality of a place that has been surprised into stillness. "The wall held while we were here," Jon said. "Yes, it won't hold forever." "No," Stannis agreed. "It won't." Jon watched the snow fall on King's Landing, on this city of stone and ambition, and 500,000 people who had spent the last several months moving between one set of rulers and another, and were now, in the snow's assessment, doing exactly what they had always done, which was continue. "The lords in the south don't believe it," Jon said. "The White Walkers. The dead. Most of them think it's a northern story, something to frighten children. Most of them have not been north of the neck," Stannis said. "No, most of them have not died and come back either," Stannis said. He said it with complete flatness, in the way he said everything, as an observed fact, rather than a dramatic statement. "You have advantages of knowledge they lack. The question is how to transfer that knowledge to men who have no framework for receiving it." Jon had been thinking about this since Castle Black, since the night Stannis had arrived with his documents and his one bent knee and his grinding, immovable insistence on what the law required. He had been thinking about it on the march, and at Moat Cailin, and through every engagement in the Riverlands, and through the assault on King's Landing, and through the siege of the Rock. "We start with the wall," Jon said. "We send grain and men and dragonglass, every cachet we can find from the records, every obsidian deposit north of the neck. We write the threat into the official record so that every maester in every castle in the 7 kingdoms has a document about what is coming that they can read and cannot deny receiving. And the lords who dismiss it regardless," Stannis said. "Show them," Jon said. "Bring them north. Let the wall speak for itself. A man who has stood on top of it and looked into what's on the other side doesn't come back with the same arguments." He paused. "And in the meantime we build an army that can fight what's coming. Not a war between houses. Not another rebellion. A single force, from every kingdom, prepared for one specific purpose." Stannis looked at the snow accumulating on the battlement ledge before them. "That will require cooperation from men who have spent their entire lives learning to distrust each other. Yes, it will require resources redirected from every existing military priority in the realm. Yes, it will require you to convince people that the threat is real before it has demonstrated itself in a way they cannot ignore." "Yes," Jon said. "All of that." The snow kept falling. Stannis was quiet for a moment. He looked north, at the direction of the wall invisible from here, 300 leagues and a continent away, standing in the dark beyond the edge of everything. We have law, Stannis said, and an army, and a kingdom that is, for the first time in 3 years, pointing in a single direction. He looked at Jon. The snow had settled on his shoulders and he hadn't moved to brush it off, because Stannis did not adjust himself for weather. That is more than anyone has had in a long time. It is enough to begin. Jon looked north too, at the sky above the city, thick with cloud and falling white, at the darkness behind the cloud where the stars were, invisible but present, where they always were. Ned Stark had carried a secret for 16 years to give this moment its possibility. A maester had recorded 2 names in a diary without understanding what he was writing. Stannis Baratheon had crossed the shivering sea and given up a crown and taken a knee on a cold stone floor because the law required it. All of that had been in service to this. To a young man standing on a battlement in the first snow King's Landing had seen in a generation, with a weight at his temples and a realm at his back, and a darkness coming from the north that the realm wasn't ready for yet. He would make it ready. Not today. Not in a single command or a single declaration. The way you prepared a realm was the same way you prepared a man. 1 day at a time. 1 decision at a time. 1 lesson at a time, until the thing you were building was strong enough for what it needed to face. The snow fell on the city, on the streets and the harbor and the walls and the bay, on the stones of the Sept of Baelor where a king had been crowned and an old wound had been given its first honest acknowledgement, on the Red Keep where a different king had sat the throne and made the first of what would be many thousand decisions. Jon Snow. Not Aegon. Jon, the name of a man who had grown up among brothers and learned what it meant to hold the line. The name he would make means something. Below him, King's Landing breathed and moved and continued, the way cities do. Indifferent to the snow and to the kings who came and went above it, carrying on its permanent conversation with itself. The snow kept falling. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.